This is a seismic geopolitical realignment, the shockwaves of which are radiating from Washington to Beijing and Brussels. The decisive maneuver is unfolding not on the muddy battlefields of the Donbass or in the burning forests of Kursk, but in closed-door summits 6,000 kilometers from Moscow. There, a new strategic gambit is in play. Europe is proactively engaging China to dismantle Russia's final geopolitical lifeline. At a high-level reception in Beijing, French President Emmanuel Macron remarked that China and France share a trajectory of mutual learning and cooperation. Yet, beneath the veneer of diplomatic pleasantries lies a cold realpolitik, the strategic ambiguity Beijing has cultivated for years, deepening economic roots in Europe while maintaining a rhetorical, unlimited friendship with Russia is reaching its terminus. Diplomatic consensus suggests that the narrow path China has walked between these two cliffs has effectively been blocked. For Vladimir Putin, this represents the manifestation of a long-suppressed strategic nightmare. The dream of a sovereign superpower is dissolving into a reality of forced dependency. Russia, formerly a global hegemon, is now reduced to liquidating its oil at break-even prices. This is no longer a relationship of mutual benefit, but an asymmetrical partnership, where Moscow is sliding from the status of a chess player to that of a chess piece in the calculations of others. To comprehend this pivot, one must scrutinize the Washington-Brussels axis, where U.S. signals have fractured the pillars of the transatlantic security architecture that has stood for nearly 80 years. Donald Trump's vision for a ceasefire in Ukraine was interpreted in European capitals not as a peace plan, but as a blueprint for the dismantling of continental security. The terms floated by Trump and tacitly welcomed by Putin amounted to an unconditional Ukrainian capitulation, leaving Russian armor poised at the gates of Kyiv with a frozen victory. Once the precedent is set that borders can be redrawn by force, there is no guarantee that revanchist ambitions will halt at the Baltics or Poland. The shock to European leadership is not merely the fear of territorial loss, but the trauma of strategic irrelevance. Friedrich Merz, Emmanuel Macron, and Keir Starmer, leaders of Europe's three largest economies, found themselves virtually excluded from the table where their continent's fate was being adjudicated. The prospect of Washington trading away European security to peel Russia away from China triggered an existential crisis across the continent. Faced with this strategic paralysis, Europe has refused to capitulate. Instead, a bold, high-risk Plan B has been activated in the corridors of the Elysée and the Bundestag. If Washington is prepared to liquidate the European security guarantee, Europe will engage Washington's primary systemic rival to secure its own flanks, the People's Republic of China. On the surface, Beijing remains Moscow's partner, but European intelligence has long detected fissures in that alignment, particularly regarding nuclear proliferation. From December 2024 through March 2025, the Chinese Foreign Ministry repeatedly characterized Russia's nuclear rhetoric as inappropriate and unacceptable, even floating the concept of a peacekeeping mission. In the geopolitical darkness, this divergence is Europe's ray of leverage. They understand the dynamic well. Putin may dismiss Western threats, but a whisper from Beijing commands his absolute attention. As the specter of a bilateral Trump-Putin accord loomed, Europe flipped the chessboard by integrating China into the equation. The logic is stark. If the U.S. abdicates its role in European security, Europe can effectively elevate China to the role of a security guarantor, delivering an unprecedented strategic blow to Washington's influence. In this context, Macron's December visit to Beijing was not a courtesy call. It was a transactional negotiation involving both threats and inducements. His trump card, the European single market, the last viable lifeline for China's sputtering economy, the proposition Paris placed on the table was binary: restrain Russia, force Putin to negotiate on acceptable terms, and halt all nuclear brinkmanship. In return, while the U.S. erects tariff walls against Chinese goods, Europe will keep its market gates open. For Moscow, this is a comprehensive disaster. Russia's fate is no longer determined in the Kremlin, but by the economic imperatives of the Chinese Communist Party. Why is Beijing rolling out the red carpet Analysts posit that the middle path strategy balancing trade with the West while backing Russia has been rendered obsolete by economic gravity. China is navigating its most critical economic inflection point in 3 decades. Domestic consumption is anemic, the real estate sector is in structural collapse, and youth unemployment has surged. These factors compel Beijing to double down on exports. With the U.S.-China trade war sealing off North America, Europe is no longer an option. It is an imperative. Armed with this leverage, Macron arrived in Beijing on December 5. Back-channel intelligence, corroborated by a December 7 Bloomberg report, indicates his core message was blunt. China's ability to sustain its massive trade surplus with Europe is directly contingent on addressing Europe's security concerns regarding Russia. Macron subtly intimated that if Beijing continues to underwrite Russian aggression, the EU market will close, imperiling China's export-led growth model. For Beijing, this is not an emotional decision, but a cold cost-benefit analysis. On one side sits the shrinking, sanctioned Russian market. On the other lies the European Union, with 450 million affluent consumers. In a year where domestic consumption failed, the property bubble burst, and U.S. tariffs of up to 84% walled off America. Exports to the EU exceeded $530 billion in the first 10 months of 2025 alone, accounting for 62% of China's total trade surplus. Beijing respects these numbers above all else. Consequently, while Chinese propaganda continues to parrot slogans of unlimited friendship behind closed doors, the policy is strictly China first. The Russian alliance, once a strategic asset, is mutating into a liability, and Moscow, the Kremlin, is effectively turning Russia into a resource colony to fuel Beijing's neutrality. This asymmetry is starkly recognized by Russia's own elite. In leaked internal assessments, Rosneft CEO Igor Sechin warned of Russia becoming a mere raw material appendage to China. Energy experts view this as the onset of vassalization, a former superpower sliding into the role of a resource supplier. In the energy sector, Russia is trapped in a buyer's market. With Europe lost, the only consumer of significance is China, exploiting its monopsony power. Beijing demands deep discounts. Russia sells oil not at global market rates, but at strategic markdowns dictated by China. Worse, when Russia utilizes those yuan reserves to procure technology, it hits another wall, severed from Western supply chains. Russian industry is wholly dependent on Chinese manufacturing. Data from OSINT analyst Tendar on November 25 reveals that Chinese goods sold in Russia carry a markup of 87% above the global average. Chinese exporters, sensing Russia's desperation, are applying a hefty risk premium. This is a classic colonial economic model. Extract cheap raw materials, sell back expensive finished goods. Control over Russia's economic sovereignty is shifting to Beijing. A mere logistical hiccup in China could now paralyze the Russian war machine. At the negotiation table, Macron's tariff card is potent enough to disrupt China's neutrality calculus. The macroeconomic picture is clear. To revitalize its economy, China is pivoting to electric vehicles and green tech. With North America closed, the EU is the final destination for this industrial overcapacity. Beijing intends to dump this production in Europe, use the proceeds to buy cheap Russian energy, and maintain its geopolitical balance. Macron struck at this nerve, leveraging the EU's capacity to impose tariffs matching the U.S. and launching anti-subsidy investigations. This poses an existential threat to a Chinese leadership desperate to avoid factory closures and social unrest. Macron linked this economic reality directly to the Russian file. Continued support for Moscow puts the European market at risk. In this equation, Russia is losing its status as a strategic partner and becoming a bargaining chip traded between Beijing and Brussels. Russia's destiny now hinges more on tariff schedules in Brussels than on general staff meetings in Moscow. While this grand bargain is negotiated, the Russian state is being reshaped. This is most visible in Gazprom, once the avatar of Russian power. Having lost Europe, Gazprom is entirely beholden to China, yet Beijing continues to delay the Power of Siberia 2 pipeline. Analysts suggest China is deliberately waiting for Russia's desperation to peak to lock in rock-bottom pricing. Gazprom's profitability is eroding, and this economic gravity is pulling the Russian Far East into China's orbit. This is not a military occupation, it is economic absorption. Visa-free regimes and cross-border trade are integrating the region into the Chinese economy. Russia provides the land and resources, China provides the capital and finished goods. The railways are becoming one-way logistics corridors extracting raw materials. Moscow remains the political sovereign, but the economic patron has changed. Will Xi Jinping abandon Russia? Not entirely. Beijing is adopting a strategy of strategic patience. It positions itself as a neutral broker, promoting the Friends of Peace initiative. However, following Macron's visit, the middle path has been redefined. Unlimited friendship is evolving into a conditional and managed relationship. According to South China Morning Post analysis, Chinese leadership appears willing to curb Russia's nuclear threats and push for a frozen conflict to safeguard European trade. Beijing's ideal outcome is a weakened, isolated Russia that is dependent on China, but not one that collapses or pivots back to the West. China needs Russia as a junior partner, not a chaotic failed state. This is the ultimate peril for the Kremlin. Russia's national interests are being commoditized to preserve Beijing's economic stability. The Russian elite fears that in a grand bargain between Beijing and Europe, Russia will be the item on the menu, not the diner at the table. The events of early December confirm that China has reached the limits of its comfortable middle ground. Macron has successfully utilized the European market to force China to choose. History will likely record the Putin era not merely for territorial expansion, but as the period when Russia lost its economic axis. This is not speculation. It is a reality revealed in customs, data, and trade accords. Sovereignty, in its truest sense, is the agency to decide to whom one sells resources and at what price. By narrowing its options under sanction pressure, Russia has taken out a heavy mortgage on its future held by China. On the map, the Russian Federation remains unchanged, but its economic center of gravity is irrevocably drifting into the dragon's shadow. Can Russia extricate itself from this dependency, or is this a geopolitical cul-de-sac? Share your sober analysis in the comments.